The soldiers all mocked his rifle, because it wasn't an issued rifle, not a standard one, and unsuitable for the modern battlefield. In the dense jungles of Guadalcanal, they soon discovered that they hadn't lost men to Japanese snipers due to bad luck, poor tactics, or treacherous terrain, but because the army had silently overlooked something far more dangerous: individual skill. And at that moment, when the jungle finally fell silent, they understood why entire units had suffered heavy losses for weeks, while one man, armed with the wrong rifle, had ended the nightmare in just 4 days. By the time the army admitted something was wrong, Guadalcanal had already taught them how little control they truly had. The fighting for Henderson Field had never been clean, never decisive. Men advanced, men pulled back, ground changed hands, then changed again. On paper, the Americans were winning. In reality, the jungle refused to acknowledge any victory. It swallowed sound, distorted distance, and punished movement with sudden, invisible violence. West of Point Cruz, that violence became routine. Patrols left at dawn and came back missing someone. Supply runners dropped without warning. Men learned to walk slower, crouch lower, and listen harder, but none of it mattered. The shots came from nowhere. No muzzle flash, no clear direction, just a crack, a body, and the horrible delay before anyone realized what had happened. At first, officers blamed nerves, then terrain, then bad luck. Then the numbers stopped cooperating. In 72 hours, 14 Americans were killed in the groves. Not wounded, not pinned down, dead, one by one, always from different angles, always without a visible enemy. The jungle had found a rhythm. The Japanese soldiers responsible weren't charging, weren't probing, weren't trying to hold ground. They were patient. They climbed before dawn, settled into massive banyan trees, and waited. From 90 feet above the forest floor, they could see everything that mattered: trails, water points, supply routes, and nothing that didn't. The Americans never saw them. Every infantry tactic the army trusted depended on contact. Find the enemy, fix him, destroy him. But here, there was no contact, just loss. The men couldn't return fire because there was nothing to fire at. You can't suppress a tree when you don't know which branch is killing you. Fear began to do what bullets could not. Men hesitated before stepping into clearings. They stopped volunteering for patrols. Supply movement slowed, then stalled. Officers noticed soldiers scanning upward more than forward. Rifles pointed uselessly at canopies thick enough to hide entire squads. This wasn't just a sniper problem. It was a control problem. And control is everything in war. By the third day, the battalion commander stopped asking where the shots were coming from. He started asking who could stop them. The answer, uncomfortably, was no one he trusted. There was no sniper doctrine in the U.S. Army in early 1943. No formal training pipeline. No standardized equipment. The Marines had experimented with scoped rifles, but nothing systematic had followed. The Army had chosen standardization instead. One rifle, one manual, one way of fighting. It worked until it didn't. Guadalcanal didn't care about manuals. That night, under a canvas roof heavy with humidity and exhaustion, the commander studied a map marked with red grease pencil. 14 deaths. Same area, same pattern, same helplessness. He needed someone who could see what others couldn't. That was how John George was summoned. George didn't look like an answer. He wasn't loud. He wasn't decorated. He wasn't part of the battalion's informal hierarchy. He was young, precise, and had spent most of the campaign doing exactly what he'd been told: carry his rifle, keep quiet, don't attract attention, except for the rifle. Everyone noticed the rifle. It didn't look like it belonged. The stock was different. The scope sat wrong. The whole thing felt civilian, personal, almost intimate, in an army that valued uniformity above all else. It was the kind of weapon you expected to see on a deer stand in Illinois, not in a jungle where men died for lifting their heads too high. The mockery had never been subtle. It didn't need to be. The Army polices itself through tone, and George's rifle had violated it. Now that same rifle sat between him and the battalion commander. The commander didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply laid out the problem. Snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. Patrols were paralyzed. Morale was eroding. If this continued, the unit would lose operational freedom entirely. Then he asked a question that felt more like a challenge than a request. Could George actually hit anything with that rifle? George didn't answer the way men usually do when cornered. He didn't boast. He didn't hedge. He didn't appeal to authority. He spoke in facts, competitions, distances, results, because facts were the only currency he trusted. The commander listened, not because he was convinced, but because there was nothing left to lose. George was given a single morning. No team, no spotter, no second chance. If he failed, the rifle would disappear back into the tent, and the battalion would go on bleeding until someone higher up found a solution or replaced them. If he succeeded, something far more dangerous would happen. The army would have to admit it had been wrong. Before dawn, George moved alone into the ruins of a Japanese bunker overlooking the groves. The position was half collapsed, partially buried, barely recognizable as a fighting position. It wasn't chosen for comfort. It was chosen because it offered a view without announcing itself. He brought only what he could carry. No radio, no runner. Ammunition counted carefully. Water measured like time. As the light crept in, the jungle woke up. Birds, insects, distant artillery. None of it mattered. George wasn't listening for sound. He was watching for absence movement where there shouldn't be any, stillness where something was hiding. This was not marksmanship. This was reading a system. Every sniper who had killed Americans in those groves believed the same thing. That the trees made them invisible, and time worked for them. George understood something they didn't yet realize. Time cuts both ways. And in a war that believed numbers and standardization solved everything, one man was about to test whether patience and precision still had a place on the battlefield. Because once the first shot was fired, there would be no pretending this was theory anymore. Only results. John George had learned early in the campaign that ridicule was a form of control. No one had ordered him to stop carrying the rifle. They didn't have to. In an army built on conformity, laughter did the work just as effectively. A raised eyebrow, a joke shared a little too loudly, a casual remark about real weapons spoken just close enough to hear. It was never about the rifle itself. It was about what the rifle represented. Every man in the battalion carried the same thing for a reason. Same weight, same action, same manual, same expectations. Uniform equipment meant predictable behavior, and predictable behavior meant control. The Army trusted systems, not exceptions. George was an exception. He had paid for that rifle himself, years before the war. Chosen it, tuned it, learned its trigger until the break felt inevitable instead of surprising. He trusted it not because someone told him to, but because it had already proven itself, again and again, under rules that didn't care who you were. That made officers nervous. A man who trusted his own judgment more than doctrine was a problem waiting to happen. He didn't fit neatly into formations or expectations. He couldn't be reduced to a checklist. So they mocked him. They mocked the scope. Too delicate. They mocked the bolt action. Too slow. They mocked the idea that a civilian hunting rifle had any place in a modern war. Captain Morris was more direct than most. He didn't laugh. He ordered, "Leave the sporting rifle in your tent. Carry a real weapon." George nodded. He always nodded. Then he did what he believed was right. He carried the rifle anyway. Not out of defiance. Not to prove a point. Because he understood something the others didn't yet. When the system failed, only personal skill remained. And if the jungle demanded precision, he would answer with the tool that gave him the best chance to survive. For weeks, it didn't matter. The battalion fought Marines' battles, advanced where they were told, held ground already soaked with months of blood. George fired his rifle exactly 0 times in combat. Every joke grew sharper with each passing day. Then the snipers appeared. Suddenly, the laughter felt brittle. The commander didn't summon George because he believed in him. He summoned him because the men he did believe in had no answers left. The decision wasn't courageous, it was desperate. And desperation changes the rules. The conversation was brief. It had to be. Authority could not afford to linger on doubt. George was given a chance, but it came wrapped in conditions designed to preserve hierarchy. One morning, one position, one attempt. If he failed, the story would be simple. A foolish lieutenant trusted a toy and paid for it. The system would be vindicated. If he succeeded, the story would be far more complicated. George understood the risk immediately. Not the physical risk, the professional one. Success would not make him popular. It would make him dangerous. Men who embarrassed institutions rarely get thanked for it. Still, he accepted. Before dawn, George prepared alone. He didn't rush. He didn't dramatize the moment. He cleaned the rifle carefully, checking every surface, every contact point. The jungle punished carelessness, not ignorance. He wasn't ignorant. The rifle had crossed an ocean packed in grease meant to defeat rust, not humidity. He stripped it again, cleaned it again, checked the scope mounts with fingers that remembered every adjustment from years before the war. The ammunition mattered too. He chose deliberately. Same cartridge the Garand fired, but loaded for precision, not volume. 5 rounds in the rifle. More carried, but not wasted. When the light began to change, George moved. The bunker he chose was not ideal. It was partially destroyed, barely recognizable, and offered no protection from artillery or mortars. That was precisely why it worked. No one expected it to be occupied. From there, he could see into the groves without being silhouetted against the sky. The banyan trees dominated everything massive, ancient, wide enough to swallow men whole. They were perfect hiding places. George didn't search for men. He searched for mistakes. Snipers believe stillness is safety. George knew better. Absolute stillness in a living jungle was a lie. Branches swayed. Leaves shifted. Insects moved. Something that didn't belong would eventually betray itself not by moving too much, but by moving at the wrong time. Minutes stretched. The battalion behind him waited without knowing they were waiting. This was the moment the jokes had unknowingly prepared him for. George wasn't fighting the enemy yet. He was fighting expectations. The expectation that a bolt-action rifle was obsolete. That magnification was unnecessary. That patience had no place in a war built on firepower. If he failed now, it wouldn't just confirm the mockery. It would kill the idea that individual mastery still mattered. Somewhere in the trees, a Japanese sniper believed he was invisible. He believed the Americans below were blind, predictable, bound to trails and habits. George believed something else. That skill doesn't announce itself. It waits. And when the first mistake finally appeared subtle, fleeting, almost deniable, George didn't hesitate. Because hesitation is what doubt looks like. And doubt had already killed too many men. The rifle came to his shoulder, not dramatically, not hurriedly, but with the quiet certainty of repetition. Breath slowed. The jungle narrowed to a single problem. In that instant, the war stopped being theoretical. The mockery, the orders, the doctrine, they all faded. Only the shot remained. And once it broke the silence, nothing about this campaign would feel the same again. The jungle did not react to the first shot the way men expect battlefields to react. There was no surge of gunfire, no answering volley, no sudden chaos. The sound cracked once, sharp and isolated, then vanished into the canopy as if it had never existed. For a long moment, nothing happened. That was the most dangerous part. George kept his eye in the scope. He did not look away. He did not allow himself the relief of confirmation. The rifle settled back into position as he worked the bolt by muscle memory, the empty casing flipping free and disappearing into the dirt behind him. Another round slid forward. The rifle was ready again before his thoughts caught up. High in the banyan tree, the branch that had betrayed itself stopped moving. Then gravity finished the sentence. The body fell through the canopy in pieces of motion, branches snapping, leaves tearing, the dull thud when it reached the ground. It landed hard, close enough that George felt the impact through the earth. One shot, one kill. But George did not mark it as a victory. He marked it as a beginning. Japanese snipers never worked alone. The first man in the tree had been the shooter. Somewhere nearby, the spotter would already be searching for the source of the shot, scanning for movement, trying to turn sound into direction. George stayed exactly where he was. Most men move after firing. Instinct demands it. The jungle punished instinct. George waited. Seconds stretched into something heavier. The scope forced discipline. Low magnification meant he couldn't sweep the forest in a hurry. He had to read it slowly, tree by tree, branch by branch, letting his eyes adjust to patterns instead of shapes. If the spotter moved too fast, he would be visible. If he moved too slow, he would feel safe. George counted on safety. Nearly half an hour passed before he saw it, not a man, not clearly, just a shadow sliding down bark where shadows weren't supposed to slide. Another banyan tree, offset slightly north, lower, closer to the supply trail. The spotter had made a mistake. He was relocating. George tracked the movement with the calm precision of someone who had waited his entire life for this exact kind of problem. He adjusted, not much, just enough, controlled his breathing again, pressed the trigger. The second shot echoed differently, as if the jungle itself had flinched. The spotter fell backward, tumbling out of the tree, his rifle clattering after him. Two bodies now lay in the groves, separated by yards but connected by doctrine. 2 shots, 2 dead. George did not celebrate. He reloaded. He stayed. The jungle was not finished. The third shot came toward him. It struck sandbags 6 inches from his head, spraying dirt and fragments into his face. George did not freeze. He rolled left, pressed himself into the bunker wall, and waited again. That shot had not been panicked. It had been measured. The enemy had adapted. Someone else had heard the shots, tracked the approximate position, and fired in response. That meant the snipers were communicating. It also meant they were confident enough to shoot back. George wiped dirt from his eyes and slowly returned to position. He did not search randomly, he reasoned. The shooter would have relocated after firing. He would not stay in the same tree. But in jungle this dense, relocation was limited by branches strong enough to hold a man and lines of sight that mattered. George scanned southwest. Minutes passed. Then he found him. High in a banyan, partially concealed, the shape was imperfect, but imperfect in the right way. The sniper had shifted position but not strategy. He still believed elevation equaled safety. George corrected that assumption. The third shot was quieter, not in sound, but in consequence. The sniper fell without drama. No thrashing, no noise. Just absence where presence had been. By noon, 5 Japanese snipers were dead. Word spread through the battalion faster than orders ever could. Men began drifting closer to the edge of the groves, trying to catch glimpses of something they couldn't quite believe. The same officers who had mocked George's rifle now asked questions that betrayed awe disguised as curiosity. George ignored them. Spectators were liabilities. Attention invited fire. The Japanese noticed the pattern, too. After the 5th kill, the trees stopped moving. The snipers adapted by doing nothing at all. George spent the afternoon glassing branches that refused to betray themselves. He learned the difference between patience and false hope. As the light began to fade, he withdrew without firing another shot. That night, the commander did not joke. He asked for numbers. George reported them plainly. No embellishment, no pride, just facts. The commander nodded once and told him to return at dawn. The second day began with rain. Heavy, tropical rain that blurred edges and swallowed distance. Visibility dropped. Sound changed. Movement became easier to hide and harder to detect. George sat in position and waited as the rain did the work of camouflage for both sides. When it stopped, the jungle revealed new mistakes. The first sniper of the morning had climbed during the storm, using the noise to mask movement. He chose a tree farther out than the others, had longer range, safer, smarter. George compensated and fired. The sniper fell. The response was immediate. Mortars began landing around the bunker, walking closer with each correction. The enemy had triangulated his position, not perfectly, but close enough. George did not wait for accuracy. He ran. He grabbed the rifle, moved along the tree line, dove into a shell crater just as the bunker disappeared in explosions behind him. Dirt and debris rained down. The position he had occupied moments before no longer existed. The war had escalated. From that moment on, this was no longer marksmanship. It was a duel. The Japanese sent more snipers. George killed 2 more that afternoon, one at range, one at height so extreme the sun betrayed him against the sky. By evening, 8 snipers were dead. 12 shots fired. 8 hits. 4 misses. George reported again. This time, The commander didn't just listen, he planned. Because something had become clear to everyone involved. The jungle hadn't changed. The enemy hadn't changed, but the balance had. And if one man could do this alone, then what came next would force the army to choose between preserving its pride or preserving its men. George cleaned his rifle that night with hands that did not shake. He knew the math. 11 snipers had been operating in the groves. 3 remained, and those 3 would not make the same mistakes. They had watched their comrades die. They now knew the shape of the threat hunting them, and somewhere in the darkness, they were planning how to end it. George lay awake, rifle across his lap, listening to the rain return. The first shot had proven the rifle worked. The next shots would decide whether he survived. By the third morning, the jungle no longer felt neutral. It felt alert. George sensed it before he saw it. The absence of small mistakes. The way branches held still a little too perfectly. The way nothing invited a shot. The enemy had stopped hunting out of habit and started hunting with intent. This was the point most successes collapse. Early victories create patterns. Patterns create confidence. Confidence creates predictability. George refused to give them that. He did not return to the bunker. He did not return to the fallen tree. He chose a place that offered nothing obvious, no clean silhouette, no straight line of sight, no comfort. Rocks left behind from an earlier fight, half forgotten, irregular, ugly. He climbed them carefully before first light, not to gain height, but to change angle. Angle mattered more than distance now. The rain returned before dawn, thick and relentless. It flattened sound and blurred depth. Men loved rain because it hid them. Snipers loved it because it hid mistakes. George used it to move. When the rain slowed to a drizzle, the jungle breathed again. Steam rose. Leaves shook themselves awake. Visibility crept back in fragments, not all at once. At first, he saw nothing. Then, he saw what didn't belong. Low in a palm tree, closer than he expected. A shape tucked into fronds that should have been impenetrable from the ground. The position was clever. Too clever. It offered concealment over elevation, patience over dominance. George raised the rifle and stopped. It was too clean. After 3 days, no survivor would choose a position that obvious, unless it was meant to be seen. George lowered the scope and widened his search. He did not look for the shooter. He looked for the watcher. Minutes passed. The jungle tried to exhaust him with sameness. Then, 80 yards away, high in a banyan tree, he saw the truth branches and vines arranged just well enough to hide a man who wasn't moving at all. The real sniper. The palm tree was bait. George understood the trap instantly. If he fired at the hidden sniper, the sound would give away his position. The man would relocate before a second shot could follow. If he fired at the bait, the real sniper would move, and movement was the one thing George could punish. He chose movement. The bait dropped from the palm. As predicted, the hidden sniper turned toward the sound. Just a fraction. Just enough. George fired again before the turn could finish. 2 shots. 2 bodies. New pows. New confirmation. George grabbed the rifle and ran. He moved east along the rocks and dropped into a drainage ditch, mud and water swallowing him to the chest. He stayed there, submerged, the rifle held vertically to keep the barrel clear. He did not move. Seconds later, machine gun fire tore through the rocks he had just abandoned. Stone chipped. Dust filled the air. The Japanese had finally solved the geometry, but too late. George waited until the firing stopped, counted to 60, then moved again. He relocated to a shell crater partially filled with rainwater and settled in, water creeping higher as he sank lower. 10 snipers were dead. 1 remained. The last one would be different. The best sniper does not seek elevation. He seeks certainty. And certainty, George realized, did not live in the trees anymore. At 9:47, George felt it rather than saw it, a disturbance at the edge of his vision. Low, slow, wrong. Movement on the jungle floor. The last sniper was hunting him the way he had hunted others. The man crawled through ferns and fallen branches, using the ground the way George had used the rocks. He moved parallel to the tree line, not toward where George was, but toward where he should have been. The sniper had learned. George stayed still. The water crept higher. Muscles burned. Insects landed and bit without consequence. Breath slowed until it barely existed. The sniper reached the rocks and took a position facing east, watching the route George would have used to escape. His back was exposed. The shot was easy. George didn't take it. Easy shots had gotten 10 men killed. He scanned wider. Then he found the second shape 70 yards away, behind a fallen tree, unmoving, watching the same escape route. The final sniper had brought help, or the last two were working together. Either way, George had a problem. A bolt-action rifle meant time between shots. Time meant reaction. Reaction meant death. So George chose a third option. He sank deeper into the water and waited. Minutes passed. The two Japanese soldiers grew impatient. They believed George had moved farther east. They stood and began a sweep, moving parallel, backs briefly exposed as they passed the crater. George rose from the water slowly, silently, the rifle already aligned. The first man fell. The bolt worked. The second man turned. George fired first. Silence returned, heavier than before. But silence never lasts. Voices emerged from the tree-line infantry, not snipers, recovery teams, search parties, men who followed tracks instead of patterns. George sank back into the crater. Boot prints betrayed him. The voices came closer. 20 yards. Then a face appeared at the rim, eyes widening. George fired from the water. The man fell backward. 2 more followed. George fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Shouting erupted. Rifles cracked. The jungle exploded into motion. George broke contact. He ran north, dove behind a fallen tree, fired again at advancing figures. 2 rounds left. More voices. Flanking movement. He ran. 90 seconds of blind sprinting through vines and branches, bullets snapping past. Then another crater, dry this time. Silence. The Japanese did not pursue. They regrouped around their dead. George checked the rifle. Mud everywhere. Water dripping from the barrel. 2 rounds left. No clips. He moved back toward American lines, slowly, carefully, every step deliberate. When he reached the perimeter, no one cheered. They stared, because something had changed. The snipers were gone. The groves were quiet. But the cost of that quiet was now visible. This was no longer about a rifle. It was about what happened when one man forced an army to confront a truth it had avoided by surviving long enough to make denial impossible. And the army, like the jungle, does not forgive lessons learned too late. By the time the shooting finally stopped, the battalion believed the danger had passed. That belief was the most dangerous thing left in the groves. George understood this before anyone said it out loud. He had learned, over 3 days and a narrowing margin for error, that violence didn't end when the enemy fell silent. It only changed shape. Silence meant observation. Observation meant planning. And planning meant the next mistake would be punished harder than the last. The jungle was quiet because it was thinking. Back at headquarters, the questions came quickly. How many? From where? How far? What rifle? What scope? The officers wanted answers they could write down, copy, and distribute. They wanted something transferable. George gave them numbers, but he didn't give them comfort. He explained that the rifle wasn't the solution. Neither was the scope. Those were tools. What mattered was how the enemy thought and how predictably the Americans had been behaving. For the first time since Guadalcanal, the conversation shifted away from equipment and toward behavior. That was the real breakthrough. George was ordered back into the groves at dawn. Not alone this time, but with instructions to continue exactly as before. The commanders wanted confirmation, not theory. They needed proof that this wasn't a fluke. George agreed on one condition: no spectators, no interference, no attempts to improve his method. They accepted because they didn't yet understand the method well enough to interfere with it. Before first light, George returned to the trees, but not to the places that had worked. Repetition creates expectation, and expectation creates traps. He chose positions that felt wrong, too exposed, too awkward, too inconvenient to be comfortable. Comfort was the enemy now. As the sun rose, he didn't look for snipers. He looked for patterns. He studied where the Japanese had operated, then where they had stopped operating. Absence told him more than presence. If a grove had been active and then went silent, it wasn't cleared. It was being watched. The enemy wasn't gone. They were observing him the way he had observed them. This was no longer marksmanship. This was counterintelligence. George moved slower than before. He fired less. He allowed the jungle to convince the enemy he wasn't there, that the threat had passed, that the system had returned to normal. Then he waited for impatience. The first sniper revealed himself by trying to be clever. He chose a position that watched the routes George should have used, not the ones he actually favored. He assumed the American would behave logically. That assumption killed him. George fired once and moved immediately. No follow-up, no confirmation. He denied the enemy information as deliberately as he denied them ground. The second sniper did not make the same mistake. He did not climb high. He did not move during daylight. He waited until shadows stretched and depth perception failed. George found him anyway, not by seeing him, but by seeing what the sniper could see. A supply trail, a water point, a place where Americans hesitated. Snipers protect value. They don't choose random trees. George fired again. By midday, the groves felt hollow, not safe but empty of intention. The Japanese had lost more than men. They had lost initiative. That was when the army finally began to understand. It wasn't the kill count that mattered. It was control. George had taken it away from the enemy and returned it to his own unit. The battalion commander asked a question no one had asked before. Could this be taught? George didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't know, but because the answer was complicated. Marksmanship could be taught. Discipline could be taught. Equipment could be issued. But judgment, the ability to read a battlefield as a living system that took something else. Time, failure, humility. Still, George agreed to try. What followed was not a training course. It was a filter. He started with men who already knew how to shoot. That wasn't negotiable. He refused to build fundamentals under fire. The jungle punished learning curves with blood. He paired men deliberately, not by rank, but by temperament. One shooter, one observer, two minds watching the same problem from different angles. Roles could switch, but responsibility could not be divided. The teams learned quickly or they didn't. Those who couldn't slow themselves down, who rushed shots, who needed certainty before acting, were reassigned. This was not an insult. It was survival. The men who remained learned how to disappear. They learned to move before dawn, settle in, and do nothing for hours. They learned that firing was not the goal. Influence was. If a single unseen shot stopped movement along a trail for a day, that was a success. George taught them to think like the enemy. Where would you hide? What would you watch? What mistake would you make when bored, tired, or confident? The results came fast. Snipers who had terrorized patrols vanished. Infantry units moved with less hesitation. Supply lines reopened. The jungle did not become friendly, but it became readable. In less than 2 weeks, George's teams achieved something the battalion hadn't managed in months. 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. That number mattered. Word moved up the chain not as a story, but as a solution. A quiet one. No press releases. No speeches. Just a note passed between officers who understood what it meant. The Army had entered the Pacific without a sniper doctrine. Now it had one built not from manuals, but from necessity. George never claimed credit. He didn't need to. The effect was visible. The men knew. The commanders knew. And the enemy knew. The jungle, once filled with unseen eyes, now felt watched by Americans instead. But George understood something the others did not yet see. This success was temporary. The war would move. The terrain would change. And the next battlefield would demand a different answer. Skill could win fights, but adaptation was what won wars. And the jungle, patient as ever, was already waiting for the next lesson to be learned the hard way. For the first time since arriving on Guadalcanal, the battalion moved as if the jungle had loosened its grip. Patrols advanced without stopping every few steps. Supply runners moved again in daylight. Men lifted their eyes from the canopy and looked forward instead of up. The snipers were gone, or so it seemed. This was the moment commanders wait for, the moment when the problem appears solved. George did not share the relief. He had learned that danger did not announce its return. It waited for confidence to do the announcing for it. And confidence was spreading fast. The sniper teams George had trained were effective, disciplined, and invisible. They did their work quietly and disappeared before patterns could form. But invisibility is fragile. Every success increases the number of people who know it exists, and knowledge spreads faster than bullets. Japanese forces in the area had not retreated because they were beaten. They were retreating because they were reorganizing. Snipers were tools. Infantry was the answer. The first sign came without warning. A patrol found bodies where none had been before, not snipers in trees, but infantry on the ground, positioned deliberately, watching the same routes the snipers once controlled. The enemy had shifted from precision to presence. George understood the implication immediately. Sniper dominance had forced the Japanese to abandon elevation. Now they would flood the ground, trade subtlety for numbers, and hunt the hunters. This was not a duel anymore. It was a search. Orders came down quickly. George was told to continue operations, but to operate with greater caution. Support was offered. More men. Radios. Fire. Support. George refused most of it, not because he believed he was invincible, but because he knew attention was lethal. A sniper team that looked like a unit would be treated like one. Mortars didn't care how good your rifle was. He moved out again before dawn. Alone this time. Not to hunt, but to confirm a suspicion. The jungle was wrong. Tracks crossed paths too cleanly. Branches were disturbed where no sniper would climb. The enemy was moving in numbers now, not pairs. They were using sound, not silence. George took position near a familiar area, rocks where earlier fighting had scarred the ground. It was a risk. Familiarity was a liability. But familiarity also revealed change. That was when he heard it. Voices. Not whispers. Not signals. Conversation. Multiple men moving deliberately through the trees. Infantry. Not snipers. George sank into a shell crater, water pooling around him, and waited. The voices passed, then returned. Searching. Talking. They weren't careful. They didn't need to be. They were sweeping, not stalking. This was a different kind of danger. When the first soldier appeared at the crater's edge, George fired from the water. The man fell backward in surprise. Two more followed. Reacting too late, George worked the bolt with hands slick from mud and rain. 3 shots, 3 bodies. Shouting erupted. Rifle fire cracked through the trees, blind and angry. Bullets struck earth and wood. The enemy did not know exactly where George was, but they knew he was close. That was enough. George moved. He ran low, broke contact, dropped behind a fallen tree, fired again at advancing figures. 2 rounds left. No time to reload. No room to stay. The Japanese flanked aggressively now. This was infantry work, pressure from multiple directions, movement to force mistakes. George had one advantage left: speed. He broke through the undergrowth, branches tearing at his uniform, rounds snapping past. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs protested, then dove into another crater. Silence followed, heavier than before. The Japanese did not pursue. They regrouped around their dead, confident they had driven the threat away. That confidence would cost them later, but it almost cost George everything. When he finally returned to American lines, he was empty. 2 rounds left. No spare clips. Mud in the action. Water in the barrel. The battalion commander listened in silence as George reported what had happened. This was not the outcome anyone wanted. The snipers were gone, yes, but the enemy had adapted again. The ground was no longer safe. The jungle had simply changed the rules. And worse, George's method, so effective in a narrow window, was becoming known. That made it vulnerable. The commander made the only decision that made sense. He pulled George out, not as punishment, as preservation. Because the truth had finally surfaced. Success had made George a priority target. The enemy was no longer reacting to the battlefield. They were reacting to him. The sniper program would continue, but without its architect at the front. Others would apply the lessons. George would not be asked to prove them again with his own life. That night, as George cleaned the rifle for the 100th time, he understood the deeper lesson Guadalcanal had taught him. Individual brilliance can break a problem open, but it cannot hold the line forever. Wars are won by systems, but only after someone bleeds enough to show the system what it lacks. The jungle had taken its toll, and the war was far from finished. Because somewhere else, in a different kind of jungle, a new battlefield was forming, one that would demand everything George had learned, and then ask for more. Burma was waiting. Removing John George from the front did not end the work. It allowed it to spread. For the first time since the campaign began, the battalion had proof that the jungle could be controlled not by luck, not by brute force, but by understanding. What George had done could no longer be dismissed as an anomaly. Too many variables lined up, too many outcomes changed. The Army did not announce a revelation. Armies never do. Instead, it adjusted quietly, cautiously, and without admitting error. Orders filtered down through channels that avoided attention. A small number of rifles were reassigned. Optics that had once gathered dust were pulled from storage. Men with marksmanship backgrounds were identified. Not for promotion, but for isolation. They were told to report early. They were told to listen. They were told nothing about glory. George did not stand in front of them as a hero. He stood as a filter. He made it clear from the beginning. This was not about shooting skill. Anyone could learn to hit a target on a range. Combat did not reward that kind of certainty. Combat rewarded restraint. The first lesson was waiting. Men were ordered into positions and told to do nothing. Not for minutes, for hours. Some failed immediately. They shifted, they fidgeted, they looked for something to act on. George watched and took notes. Those men were reassigned. This work required a tolerance for boredom that bordered on indifference. A sniper who needed action would invent it, and invention got people killed. The next lesson was judgment. George walked them through terrain and asked questions instead of giving instructions. Where would you hide? Why here and not there? What would you watch if you were trying to kill someone like you? Wrong answers were not punished. Confidence was. The men who succeeded learned to see the battlefield as a system of incentives. Trails existed for a reason. Water points revealed habits. Fear shaped movement more reliably than orders ever could. George did not teach them how to kill. He taught them how to deny options. A single, unseen shot could shut down a route for a day. A body left in the wrong place could reroute patrols for a week. Influence mattered more than numbers. The structure followed naturally. Teams of two, one shooter, one observer. Roles could switch, but responsibility could not. If one man failed, both owned it. That bond mattered. Lone snipers disappeared too easily. Pairs endured. Within days, the effect was measurable. American casualties dropped. Movement resumed. The jungle felt watched again, but this time by the right people. Reports moved upward with unusual speed. Not dramatic reports, clean ones. Numbers, trends, outcomes. The kind that commanders trusted. By early February, the experiment had a name. It wasn't official. It didn't need to be. Those involved understood what it represented. A doctrine being born in real time, under fire, without permission. George never argued for recognition. He didn't need to. The men he trained did the talking for him every time they returned without losses. In less than 2 weeks, the sniper section accounted for dozens of confirmed enemy casualties. More importantly, they did it without friendly deaths during sniper operations. That number mattered more than any kill count. It meant the system worked. Higher command took notice not because they wanted to change the Army, but because the Army had already changed without asking. When orders came down to prepare for movement east, the sniper section remained. Not as an experiment anymore, but as a requirement. Wherever the jungle followed, they would follow too. George was informed of the next assignment privately. Burma, a different war, a deeper jungle, a mission built around small units operating without supply lines. Everything he had learned on Guadalcanal would be tested again, this time without margin for error. Before leaving, George made one request. He wanted to keep his rifle. It wasn't sentimental. It was practical. He trusted it. He understood it. And trust, in places like Burma, mattered more than weight or appearance. The request was approved without discussion. That, more than any medal, told George everything he needed to know. The Army had stopped laughing. It had not apologized. It had not explained itself. It had simply adapted. And that adaptation, quiet, reluctant, and incomplete, would follow American forces long after the jungle of Guadalcanal faded behind them. Because once an army learns that one man can expose a flaw in its thinking, it never quite forgets the possibility again. Even if it pretends to. Burma erased illusions faster than Guadalcanal ever had. The jungle there was not a maze of groves and trees you could learn in pieces. It was a wall continuous, vertical, wet, and unforgiving. Slopes replaced trails, rivers replaced roads, distance stopped being measured in yards and started being measured in exhaustion. This was not a place where a single rifle could dominate terrain. It was a place that punished anyone who believed yesterday's success would carry forward, unchanged. George understood that within days, the mission wasn't to hold ground or clear pockets. It was to move constantly, quietly, and far beyond supply lines. Long-range patrols cut across terrain the Japanese believed large forces could never cross. Everything depended on speed, endurance, and the ability to disappear. Weight mattered now. Every ounce argued for its own removal. Food, ammunition, clothing, even confidence. George modified his rifle without ceremony. A lighter scope replaced the old one. Unnecessary parts were removed, not because the rifle had failed, but because the environment had changed. That distinction mattered. Burma did not offer long, clean sightlines. Engagements happened fast and close. Visibility collapsed into 30 feet of green confusion. Most fights were ambushes measured in seconds, not hours. In that chaos, semi-automatic rifles excelled. Volume mattered. Suppression mattered. Speed of follow-up mattered. George fired his rifle rarely. When he did, it was deliberate. One shot, then movement. Never a second chance offered to the enemy. He had learned that a distinctive report was a beacon. In Burma, beacons attracted entire units. The rifle was no longer a centerpiece. It was a tool among many. That realization cut against the story others wanted to tell. Back on Guadalcanal, the narrative had already begun to simplify itself. One man, one rifle, one solution. Burma refused to cooperate with that myth. The jungle didn't care what had worked before. George watched men fall not because they lacked skill, but because the environment demanded something different. Malaria cut deeper than bullets. Dysentery erased strength faster than combat ever could. Patrols that should have lasted days stretched into weeks. The unit bled slowly. By the time they reached their objective, more men were gone from disease than from enemy fire. Success came, but it came stripped of celebration. This was the real lesson Burma offered. There is no perfect weapon. There is no permanent advantage. There is only adaptation under pressure. George survived the campaign, but he did not come out believing he had solved war. If anything, he came out convinced that war constantly outruns solutions. What had worked on Guadalcanal worked because the conditions allowed it to work. Burma required something else. Flexibility without attachment. Skill without pride. The rifle that had changed doctrine became just another carried burden, useful in moments, irrelevant in others. That did not diminish it. It contextualized it. When the unit was finally pulled out, broken by attrition and disease, the war moved on without pause. New battles, new terrain, new demands. George left Burma with no illusions intact. Individual skill could still matter. It could still save lives. But it could never replace systems entirely. And systems, once exposed, never stay still. The Army would continue to formalize sniping. It would refine equipment, doctrine, training, not because one man had proven it possible, but because multiple environments had proven it necessary. Burma closed the chapter that Guadalcanal had opened, not with triumph, with humility. And that humility, hard-earned, uncomfortable, and easily forgotten, was the real inheritance George carried forward. Because the most dangerous thing a soldier can believe is that the last war taught him everything he needs to know for the next one. Burma proved, brutally, that it never does. When John George left Burma, there was no sense of completion. The campaign had ended, but nothing felt resolved. There was no moment of clarity, no clean line between before and after. The jungle simply released him, the way it releases most survivors, without ceremony, without explanation. The unit he had marched into Burma with no longer existed in any meaningful way. Men were reassigned, hospitalized, sent home, or buried under paperwork that reduced months of suffering to lines on a form. Merrill's Marauders would be remembered as an audacious idea, a brutal experiment, and a success that could never be repeated in the same way again. George carried that understanding with him. He did not return to the United States as a legend. He returned as an officer who had done his job and learned lessons that didn't fit neatly into after-action reports. The Army promoted him, reassigned him, and placed him where armies place men who have seen too much to be ignored, but too little to be mythologized. Training commands, classrooms, firing ranges. There, George taught without drama. He did not talk about Point Cruz unless asked. He did not describe the trees, the water-filled crater, or the moments where breath and patience mattered more than courage. He taught fundamentals instead: movement, judgment, restraint. The kind of things that sound obvious until you need them most. The rifle followed him home. It moved from jungle to ship, from ship to stateside quarters, from armory to footlocker. It sat cleaned, oiled, functional, and increasingly irrelevant to the war that was now being fought across oceans and continents with overwhelming force. George understood the shift. The war was industrial now. Armies moved by the million. Equipment was standardized not because it was perfect, but because it was scalable. The idea that one man, with one rifle, could bend events had no place in a conflict decided by factories and logistics. That did not make the earlier lesson false. It made it inconvenient. After the war, George did something unexpected. He wrote, not speeches, not memoirs, meant to inspire. He wrote notes precise, technical, stripped of emotion, distances, conditions, observations, what worked, what failed, why something that looked foolish on paper could be decisive in practice. He wrote because memory fades faster than doctrine changes. The manuscript was never meant to be public. It was a record, not a story. When it was finally published, it didn't attract mass attention. It attracted a different audience, people who understood that war is learned one detail at a time. George did not correct the myths that slowly formed around his service. He didn't deny them either. He simply stepped aside. History has a way of doing that to men who don't seek it out. It compresses them into symbols or forgets them entirely. George existed in the narrow space between those outcomes known to specialists, invisible to everyone else. The rifle eventually left his possession too, placed behind glass, labeled, contextualized, neutralized. Visitors walked past it without stopping. It looked like any other old hunting rifle. No obvious scars, no visible proof of what it had done. And that was the final irony. The object that had once embarrassed an institution, forced adaptation, and saved lives now blended into the background, quiet, unremarkable, easy to ignore, just like the lesson it represented. Because history prefers noise. It prefers numbers. It prefers machines. It rarely lingers on the uncomfortable truth that sometimes, in the narrowest window of time, progress comes from a single person noticing that the system is wrong and surviving long enough to prove it. George lived long enough to see that truth fade again, which raises the question history never asks out loud. How many lessons like this have already been learned and quietly forgotten? If this story were only about a rifle, it would have ended a long time ago. Rifles age. They get replaced. Their specifications become obsolete, their materials outdated, their designs surpassed by newer solutions built for newer wars. The Winchester, that once mattered so deeply on Guadalcanal, eventually became just another artifact behind glass. What did not age as well was the lesson it forced into the open. John George did not win a battle because he owned a special weapon. He won because he recognized something the system around him could not yet admit, that war changes faster than doctrine, and that standardization, while powerful, creates blind spots. The U.S. Army entered the Pacific prepared to fight one kind of war. Guadalcanal demanded another. Burma demanded something else entirely. In each case, survival depended on how quickly individuals recognized the mismatch. George was not unique because he was brave. He was unique because he was attentive. He watched how men moved. He watched where they died. He noticed patterns others dismissed as bad luck. And when the system failed, he didn't wait for permission to think differently. That is the part history struggles with. Modern armies are built on scale. Scale demands uniformity. Uniformity rewards compliance. Compliance produces reliability. But reliability, pushed too far, becomes fragility. Every institution reaches that point eventually. When it does, adaptation doesn't arrive as a memo. It arrives as embarrassment often paid for in blood when something improper works better than what was approved. Guadalcanal exposed that moment, not with speeches, not with medals, but with silence in the trees where Americans had been dying. The army adapted, as it always does, slowly, reluctantly, just enough. Sniping became formalized. Training pipelines were built. Equipment was standardized again, this time with optics included. And, inevitably, the lesson faded. Because once a solution becomes official, it stops feeling dangerous. It stops challenging assumptions. It becomes part of the furniture until the next war. Then the cycle begins again. A new environment, a new enemy, a new doctrine that almost fits. And somewhere, someone notices the gap first. History rarely remembers that person. It remembers the machine that came later. John George did not try to be remembered. He didn't build a reputation. He didn't turn experience into spectacle. He wrote it down, passed it on, and moved aside. That may be why this story feels unfamiliar. Not because it wasn't important, but because it doesn't flatter the way we like to think about progress. We prefer to believe that institutions improve in clean lines, that systems evolve smoothly, that success is planned. The truth is messier. Sometimes, improvement arrives through a single, quiet refusal to accept that this is just how it is. Sometimes it arrives through a man with the wrong rifle, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, who survives long enough to make the right people uncomfortable. And sometimes, once the discomfort fades, the lesson disappears with it. Which leaves us with one final question, not about weapons, not about heroes, but about memory. How many times has the right answer already appeared, only to be ignored again when it stopped being inconvenient? That is why stories like this matter, because forgotten lessons have a way of coming back, when the cost of remembering them is much higher. The jungle at Point Cruz went quiet long before history noticed. No announcement, no headline, just fewer footsteps that never came back. John George didn't leave behind a monument. He didn't leave behind a doctrine with his name on it. What he left behind was far more fragile, a lesson that only exists as long as someone is willing to remember it. That sometimes the problem isn't the enemy. Sometimes it's the assumption everyone stopped questioning. One man noticed it, one rifle exposed it, and for a brief moment, the system changed. Then the war moved on. If you pause here just for a second, think about this. How many stories like this never made it into textbooks? How many men solved impossible problems, only for their solutions to be absorbed, renamed, and quietly forgotten? That's why your voice matters more than you think. Tell me in the comments, what part of this story stayed with you the most? The rifle, the patience, or the moment the army realized it had been wrong? Or if you have a different perspective, say it. Do you believe wars are really changed by individuals, or only by systems? And one more thing, if someone in your family served in any war, in any country, write their name, or just write where they served. No ranks, no medals, just a line that says they were here. Because history only disappears when no one speaks. And tonight, you just did.